Muy buenos días para todas y para todos. Les saluda desde Miami Luis Guillermo Solís, director interino del Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center de la Universidad Internacional de Florida y expresidente de la República de Costa Rica. Me siento muy honrado de participar en esta primera sesión de 3 que celebraremos entre hoy y mañana, preguntándonos cómo se mira la Cumbre de las Américas desde América Latina. Tenemos a una serie muy importante de analistas, de personas con experiencia en el terreno, en la empresa privada, en la formulación de políticas públicas, que compartirán con nosotros principalmente una visión latinoamericana, aunque también tendremos, como es el caso de la sesión inicial de esta mañana, a personas que desde los Estados Unidos participan en la organización de la cumbre. Quiero dar la bienvenida también y agradecer profundamente el copatrocinio de otras instituciones que forman parte del grupo organizador de estos encuentros. Además de la Escuela Stephen J. Green de Asuntos Públicos y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad de Florida y su centro Kimberly Green, al que pertenezco, FUNGLODE, la Fundación Global Democracia y Desarrollo de la República Dominicana, el Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, de Suecia, y Global Americans aquí en los Estados Unidos. Estas organizaciones nos hemos conjuntado para traerles este encuentro. Quiero recordar que este encuentro, como ya lo señalé, tiene 2 sesiones hoy y una sesión mañana. La primera es una conversación con representantes de la sociedad civil. La segunda, a partir de la 1 de la tarde, hora del este de los Estados Unidos, una conversación con empresas privadas respecto de la cumbre. Y mañana, a partir también de las 11 de la mañana, hora de los Estados Unidos del Este, una sobre la perspectiva de los expresidentes, expresidentes de varios países de América Latina sobre esta misma actividad. Me honra mucho presentar a quien dará inicio a la sesión de hoy, el doctor Richard Feinberg, quien es profesor emérito de la Universidad de California en San Diego y uno de los especialistas más reconocidos en los Estados Unidos sobre las relaciones de este país con América Latina. Quiero decir además que el doctor Feinberg es uno de los autores intelectuales de las Cumbres de las Américas. Me consta porque en el año 94 vi todos sus esfuerzos que se concretaron en la primera de estas cumbres en Miami, pero además de ello ha sido un funcionario con una larga y distinguida carrera en el servicio de su país. Estuvo trabajando como consejero de Seguridad Nacional en la Casa Blanca, ha tenido una muy fructífera vida académica con publicaciones de muchos libros, más de 300 publicaciones después del año 94. Te las estamos contando, Richard, y por lo tanto es una persona que puede darnos muchas luces sobre el contenido y el tamaño de lo que ha significado estas cumbres y especialmente la perspectiva sobre la próxima en Los Ángeles en el mes de junio. Richard is going to speak in English, but these events are going to be held in Spanish. I thank you very much, Richard, again for your willingness to participate. Muchas gracias a todas y todos por estar aquí y sin atrasar más nuestra discusión. Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you, my friend.
Muchas gracias, Presidente Solís. Es un gran placer estar aquí con ustedes. Quiero felicitar también a FIU, a IDEA y también a Global Americans y sobre todo a su líder tan energético y brillante, Guy Mantel, for convening this very timely webinar. It's a terrific assembly of panelists. I recognize many friends from the NGO sector, from the private sector. Tomorrow, you'll have some presidents who are veterans of past summits. So allow me here to send a virtual hello and abrazo to everyone out there in the virtual world. Summitry in the Americas has come a long way since we picked up the baton in Miami in 1994. It had been 27 years since the last summit in 1967 in Punta del Este. And now, by coincidence, it's been just another 27 years of steady periodic summitry. Los Angeles will be the 9th. Personally, I've attended 7 of the 8 summits so far, so I am a decorated summiteer. The first summit was the product of several important trends in the global ecosystem. First, it was the post-Cold War period. The hemisphere was emerging from military dictatorships, from the debt crises of the 1980s. It was a moment of grand convergence toward democratic norms, toward more open, integrated, and more prosperous growing economies. 1994 was a moment of optimism, even as the assembled leaders in Miami did recognize some of the Achilles heel, some of the weaknesses of their democratic systems. And if you read the documents of that period, and I urge everyone to do so, the leaders recognized problems of corruption, problems of inequality, problems of the inadequacy of social services. And those precisely were some of the initiatives that were approved to address those underlying concerns. Now, in the 1990s, another contextual driver was in the 1990s was a period globally of strong regionalism. You know, we talk a lot about globalization, but actually regionalism has been a very powerful force since the end of the Cold War. After all, the EU was expanding eastwards, as we see now today. APEC in Asia was elevated from ministerial meetings to full-fledged leaders' summits in the mid-90s. So the Western Hemisphere either had to step up its regionalism or be left behind. Then there was Nafta. Now, after Nafta, it was Latin America, not the United States, that pressed for extending trade preferences further south, so as not, again, to be left behind. It was Latin America that pressed hard for the free trade area of the Americas in the run-up to Miami. And I can assure you, because I was in the White House and I received the correspondence from leaders in Central America and South America, urging wider hemispheric free trade and freer investment flows. So the summit in Miami occurred in the context of certain major global shifts, just as Miami reflected and reinforced those shifts. But today we live in a different world, and we'll see that in Los Angeles. Summits in the Americas have come a long way since 1994. They are now solidly institutionalized. The OAS has a summit secretariat, and that provides continuity between summits. There's also a joint summit working group. It coordinates 13 international organizations, including the relevant multilateral development banks, which provide capital and technical assistance to help implement initiatives approved at the summits. There's also a Summit Implementation Review Group, or SURGE, that compiles information on the initiatives countries take to implement actions approved at the summit. Now, in the run-up to Miami in 1994, we did consult with civil society organizations and with many business groups. Over the years, host countries and the OAS have also institutionalized these consultations. The summits themselves now have a sequence of 3 meetings back to back. At the beginning of the week, civil society meetings. Some of them are quite dynamic and creative, as many of you will experience in Los Angeles. Then you have the CEO Business Summit, organized in the past by the Inter-American Development Bank, this year by the US Chamber of Commerce. And then finally, at the end of the week, after all those other deliberations, you have the meetings of ministers and of leaders, presidents and prime ministers. Now, typically during this week of summiteering, there are opportunities for representatives from the civil society panels and the CEO Business Summit to present their findings and to dialogue directly with ministers and leaders. We can expect ministers and leaders to speak at the Civil Society Forum, as they have in the past, and at the Business Summit, and to participate in commingled panels. Some of these exchanges are likely pro forma, but some can be substantive. I specifically recall President Obama meeting at one of these summits with a dozen civil society leaders in Panama, carefully taking notes and incorporating at least one of those suggestions from his encounter with civil society into his public remarks. So some leaders do listen. Okay, what can we expect in Los Angeles? First of all, summits cannot solve all problems. It is not a silver bullet. Some critics like to set very, very high bars, ludicrously high, so they can then turn around and declare that the leaders fell short of expectations that they themselves irresponsibly set. But what are the real purposes of summits? Let me suggest 4 vital purposes of summits. Summits focus governments on inter-American affairs, both bureaucracies and the leaders. It's an answer, summits are an answer to those who repeatedly decried the alleged lack of attention to inter-American affairs in various capitals, especially in Washington, D.C., but not only in Washington. In fact, it's not easy for Latin America, which after all, despite all of its problems, is a zone of peace with no nukes and no international terrorism. It's difficult for LAC to compete with the inevitable march of crises of the hour, whether they're in Beijing or in the Middle East or now Eastern Europe. But in the run-up to Los Angeles, the White House and the National Security Council must focus on Latin America, because particularly any event that the US hosts, that the president and vice president will attend, it must be seen as a success. That's a political reality. Otherwise, heads will roll. So first, we have high-level, intense attention on inter-American affairs as a result of summitry. A second purpose of summits can reaffirm shared norms and values at the highest levels of government. Since Miami, leaders have particularly reaffirmed representative democracy as the only legitimate form of government. Summits have also made clear that in a well-functioning democracy, citizens, civil society, have the rights to organize themselves, to make their voices heard, and to hold governments accountable. Summits have also made it very clear that in a well-functioning democracy, the private sector is a vital engine of economic dynamism, of investment, of technological innovation, of job creation. And when governments violate these consensual norms, they do so at their own peril, at a cost to their legitimacy. And hemispheric voices and national voices can refer to these consensual norms when they denounce such violations. A third purpose of summit, and as I've already mentioned, summits now offer space, they offer voice to civil society and to the private sector. These forums are not just pro forma. They are powerful symbolic affirmations that civil society and business are legitimate, essential components of democratic societies, that all of you merit seats at the table. I should add, by the way, that these gatherings at summits of civil society and business can be a lot of fun. They're a great opportunity to see friends, to network, to get updates on developments around the hemisphere, to hammer out accords among yourselves, and for some to engage in face-to-face meetings with ministers and leaders. By the way, this year, come prepared to party in Los Angeles, to take in a Dodgers baseball game that's been scheduled to be there at the time of the summit. I understand that President Biden may entertain some leaders from Latin America at the Dodgers game. It's also an opportunity to gain a glimpse of some favorite celebrities that we can expect also to be invited to entertain all of us at the summit. Now, civil society organizations and business also have a critical role to play, and I really want to underscore this point, in the implementation of summit initiatives. I suggest you should focus more on the post-summit implementation process, not just on the declarations at the event themselves. Figure out, as civil society leaders and business leaders, how to insert yourselves into that implementation process. In Los Angeles, make contact with OAS staff, with ministers, with representatives of the international organizations such as the Inter-American Development Bank and CAF, Andean Development Corporation. They will be leading the post-summit implementation with their resources, with their finance, with their technical systems. Okay, so a fourth final purpose of summits. Summits can approve specific action items. Miami launched the FTAA, which, if never fully realized, did give birth to lots of FTAs all around the hemisphere. The Quebec Summit in 2001 drove the Inter-American Democratic Charter, with which all of its flaws has been an important beacon around the hemisphere. And the 2018 Lima Summit gave impetus to a series of anti-corruption programs that I'm sure will be further analyzed in Los Angeles. Now, what's going to happen in Los Angeles? What will be the new initiatives there? Well, in his remarks last week, which I would urge you to read at the Council of Americas annual conference in DC, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who reminded us that he also was part of the Miami summit in 1994 as a speechwriter for President Clinton. And he reminded us that he amended some of the words that I had suggested for President Clinton to put those words in the language and the style of the president. Tony Blinken gave us some hints in his remarks last week as to how he and the United States see the agenda shaping up for Los Angeles. As a principal topic, not surprisingly, Tony Blinken reaffirmed the unique legitimacy of democratic institutions, a major theme undoubtedly in Los Angeles. It will be a follow-up to President Biden's Summit for Democracy last September, where many Western Hemisphere leaders and civil society representatives spoke quite eloquently about the importance of democracy and the roles of civil society and the private sector in democratic institutions. Now, Blinken also called for a collective shared approach to responding to democratic backsliding, to autocracy, as he put it. We'll see what specific proposals might be on the table. It clearly looks like the United States, as host, will not be inviting Maduro, Ortega, or Diaz-Canel. Let's see how controversial that decision is in Los Angeles. I can report from my experience that in the past, rejectionist presidents have spent their podium time denouncing the United States, even denouncing the very summit meetings that they are attending. Hardly productive, hardly conducive to the very purpose of summits, which is to reach a consensus on key norms and to propose policy solutions. At Panama, the Latin American and Caribbean governments demanded the inclusion of Cuba. And so the United States accepted that. And it was part of President Obama's opening to Cuba. And I can report that in both Lima and previously in Panama, the Cuban representatives did comport themselves respectfully in both Panama and Lima. But now, in the context of the hostile policies of the Biden administration towards Havana, a mere continuation of Trump's harsh policies, it seems that's unlikely for Havana to be invited now in that policy context in Los Angeles. Foreshadowing Los Angeles in his remarks last week, Biden also underscored the importance of building more resilience into global supply chains, a big topic these days. He referred specifically to the opening of US dialogues on supply chains with Mexico and with a new Alliance for Development in Democracy, ADD, composed of Costa Rica, Panama, and the Dominican Republic and the United States. And he even referred to specific sectors of their economies where the US is interested in fortifying those more resilient supply chains. I also noticed that the Brazilian ambassador to Washington recently suggested that supply chain resilience should be a centerpiece in Los Angeles. So let's see just how far Los Angeles goes in providing concrete incentives for firms to relocate their supply chains from Asia, from Eastern Europe into the Western Hemisphere, to what we refer to now as nearshoring or friendshoring. Friendshoring suggesting not just economic linkages, but also a certain sharing of democratic values. Blinken also drew attention to migration. Migration inevitably will be a hot topic in Los Angeles, where Latinos by some measure make up as much as half of the population of Los Angeles County. And of course, Los Angeles is not far from the border with Mexico. Blinken foreshadowed a regional declaration on migration and protection. A major ministerial was held in Panama recently trying to nail down more details for that regional declaration on migration and protection. And we'll hear more about those details, no doubt, in Los Angeles. Also in Los Angeles, climate change and renewable energy will certainly feature, as they have at every summit, beginning in 1994. Remember, in 1994, Vice President Al Gore already was pushing very hard on the concept of sustainability. And as President Solis will recall, the presidents of Central America, together with Vice President Al Gore, actually signed an agreement on sustainability for Central America back in 1994. So once again, climate change will be on the agenda. Blinken mentioned commitment to the global methane pledge, which is to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. The Secretary of State also referred to the pandemic, of course, and COVID-19. He suggested there would be pledges for financing for pandemic preparedness and public health. We'll see what sort of financial packages are put together, both from the US, but also from those 13 international institutions that make up part of the joint summit working group, and see what they may pledge towards pandemic preparedness and COVID-19 relief, what financial resources, what technical assistance they may be offering onto the table. Now, finally, Blinken also promised direct engagement in Los Angeles by governments with civil society organizations and business, as there has been in the past. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with this. There is still a month to go. A month to go. There's a rich agenda: democracy and autocracy, global supply chains, nearshoring, friendshoring, a declaration on migration, climate change, global methane pledge, pandemic preparedness. Those are all, each one of those, big topics. There's still a month to go. A month to go in diplomacy is a long time. There's plenty of time for all of you to make your voices heard, to define reasonable, smart benchmarks for measuring success in Los Angeles. And you can be sure that the US government very much wants you to be satisfied, reasonably satisfied with the procedures and outcomes of Los Angeles. And I hope you very much insert yourselves in the implementation process, just as important, perhaps more important than the pledges made in Los Angeles at that moment. So you all can help define success in Los Angeles. There is still time for all of you, civil society and business representatives and government leaders. There's still time for you to insert yourselves in the history of summitry. So have at it. Thank you very much.